clearly all Tory government ministers are tolerating the spread of woke ideology under their noses, but are there any ministers in particular who are actively pushing it?
Well, the ministers change a lot, as you know, because of political circumstances. So it's difficult to focus. I mean, in my job, I've seen ministers come and go who are more pro and against this stuff. One minister who was particularly effective in combating some of this stuff was Jacob Rees-Mogg, or at least he was interested in what was going on, whereas most ministers are too busy focusing, some would say rightly, on the crises facing in their departments, and they don't have time to look at this stuff. Having said that, even from the supposedly conservative ministers, the people who claim to be culturally conservative or anti-woke, I found that they are uninterested in this stuff. When I've tried to engage with some of their advisors and SPADs and the ministers themselves, I'm ignored, or they don't find it, that it's something that isn't of interest to them. Now, there may be other reasons why they didn't want to engage in some of the stories that I was working on. But I do think there's a certain level of cowardice within ministers, all ministers, who are afraid of the media pushback in particular that they will get if they start challenging this stuff properly. They don't want to be called racist, they don't want to be called homophobic, they're worried that, you know, their friends in North London are going to think of them in a terrible way. And this is the problem with the modern Conservative Party. Obviously, as we know, it's not conservative in any way. There are some ministers who are more effective than others. I think someone like Gillian Keegan, I mean, look at her, she's the Education Secretary. Now, she was asked a question in the Education Select Committee about people being taught in schools critical race theory and other conspiracy theories. Now, Gillian Keegan came up, if you look at her answer, she was obfuscating, she was vague, she wasn't particularly interested in something that is explosive. I mean, there was research from Eric Kaufman that showed that 70% of young people had heard of these ideas, from teachers or from adults within the schools. This should be something that the Conservatives, I mean, should first of all be looking into, and second of all, it's a great issue for them to campaign on. You know, it's such a popular topic. But Gillian Keegan, I mean, she used to be my local MP. She's a Remainer, she's metropolitan. I suspect her views are extremely liberal on social issues. Penny Mordaunt, she wrote that book. You know, and there's that famous clip of her in Parliament saying trans women are women. The Conservative Party is not conservative on these issues. And not only have they allowed the civil service to become woke, many of them have actively supported it, in particular through the Equalities Act of 2010, which the civil service uses as an excuse to push these woke ideologies. If you ask a minister why don't you just shut this stuff down, they could say, well, under the Equality Act, this is their lawful obligation to push equality, diversity and inclusion within government departments. And when I go to the civil service and I put to them, this is what you've done, have you got a comment? Generally, the civil service press officers will scream at me down the phone saying, this is under our obligations under the Equality Act of 2010. I've actually had civil servants say to me, this isn't woke. Stop. You should not be interested in this. This isn't woke. This is simply under our obligations under the Equality Act and under the diversity plans that the Tory ministers have put in place themselves, the diversity strategies. And I urge anyone to go and look up the diversity and inclusion strategies within the civil service. They lay out 5-10-year plans, very Stalinist plans, as to where they want the civil service to be in the future. So the Conservative Party are not only have they allowed this to happen on their watch, in many cases they actively promote this stuff.
Given that combating some of this stuff and rooting it out of the civil service and other public institutions would be such a vote winner, as you say, what do you think it is that they should do in particular?
They should, first of all, repeal the Equality Act 2010 or heavily amend it. So the Equality Act basically says that you can't discriminate against people based on their gender, on their race, on their religion, and a whole series of other categories, sort of identity categories. Now, one of those is not being trans, by the way. And the civil service, when they're pushing trans rights, and many of these civil servants do push trans rights within their HR and within their culture, they admit in their documents that this is not protected under the Equality Act, but we are going to go further than the Equality Act because we believe in trans rights. So they say we're doing all of this stuff because of the Equality Act. Oh, and we're also doing the trans stuff because we believe in it. So they actually go beyond the scope of the law. So the Equality Act must be repealed immediately. And also it should be appealed, or they should apply it correctly, because the Equality Act doesn't just protect against minorities, it protects against everyone. So if you're discriminated because you're white, or because you're a man, or because you're straight, that's equally wrong under the eyes of the Equality Act than if you're discriminated against if you're black or a woman or if you're gay. So the civil service, why don't they have organisations for straight white men? Why don't they have networks, what they call diversity networks, for white people or for straight people? Why do they only have them for black or women or for the minority groups? And they claim that the reason that they have these diversity networks is because of the Equality Act. But if they were applying that correctly under the in a legal sense, they should be having organisations that represent everyone. So first of all, repeal the Equality Act. Second of all, scrap every single diversity and inclusion officer within all government departments. You'd save hundreds of millions of pounds. They're completely useless. They push conspiracy theories. I mean, unconscious bias training, this is a great example. The Conservatives said they would scrap years ago. I think in 2020, they announced they're going to end all unconscious bias training in the civil service. Earlier this year, when I looked into this, it was still compulsory for all civil servants to take unconscious bias training. Now, whether that's enforced or not is another matter, but it's still there on the civil service intranet networks. It's still there within individual departments. The Conservatives, they can say on these headline grabbing things in the Mail or whatever that they're tackling this stuff, but when you actually follow up and see what they've done, it's still there. And even when ministers like Jacob Rees-Mogg said he was scrapping all diversity training, well, I kept asking him and his advisors, how are you going to do that? When are you going to do that? And the answer was never particularly forthcoming. So there's a lot there's a lot to be done. They could do, but it's a very difficult thing to do because these networks are so complicated, and the way the civil service, it's such a bureaucracy that it's very difficult. Once you sort of tackle one area, another 5 might pop up. So I think if ministers had a backbone, they could go in and they tell the civil servants, we need to scrap all of this stuff. But first of all, they need to change the law. They won't do it because they can't control the government. And this is something Dominic Cummings writes about, and Lord Frost recently in the Telegraph. Ministers do not control the government. They are not in control of the government. The civil servants are in control of the government. So if ministers were able to take back control of that bureaucracy and understand the levers of power, they could be a lot more effective in tackling the woke stuff. But at the moment, ministers are so exposed to other problems going on, in the wider context of their department. Why would they even focus on something that they might see as a minuscule or uninteresting problem?
One of the particularly interesting things about your story is the fact that it demonstrates how easily radical far-left forms of ideology can spread under the nose of a nominally Conservative government. And I wonder, since you've been in the Conservative media space for 5 years or so now, have you seen this sort of phenomena manifesting itself in the other, maybe private institutions which are actively conservative in the same way that our government claims to be?
Well, there's that old political rule, I forget who wrote it, that said every institution that is created that isn't actively conservative will be taken over by the left, right? That rule needs to be changed, because every institution, even the ones that's mission is a conservative mission, are being taken over by the left. And I think that you can look at journalism, you can look at think tanks, you can look wherever you want to see, and then these institutions are set up to be ideologically conservative, and unfortunately many people who work at these organizations are not conservative. They are the complete opposite, and they may want to work there for prestige, they may want to work there for career reasons. There may not even be enough conservatives to hire in these industries, and that may be one of the reasons why, you know, the cultural dominance of this ideology, of the sort of, you know, woke ideology is so prevalent within graduates. There may not be enough conservatives to even put, you know, to take out and hire them into these institutions. So I think that yes, unfortunately, in many of these organizations that you think are conservative, you know, and this is stuff that I've seen in some of my jobs, they're not. The people who work there are not. And if you start seeing things from these organizations that don't appear to be conservative, then that's probably one of the reasons.